Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the event, and good evening to all of those of you in Korea. My name is Bruce Klinger. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. And it's my pleasure today to host the event on what's the potential for a North Korean provocation or a summit with the United States. So before we dive in, I'd like to remind you that we want you to be part of the conversation. So please submit any questions throughout the event into the questions box. Please be sure to tell us your name, your affiliation, or where you're tuning in from, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. This session is being recorded and will be emailed to you as well as posted on the heritage.org/events within 48 hours. So last and certainly not least, like you, we're all broadcasting for our homes, so thanks for your patience if there are any small technical issues. Hopefully no small children will be walking into any of our screens. And I know this is the first time I'm hosting a webinar, so I'm juggling a lot of things. So again, we ask for your forbearance. This morning and evening, we have a very distinguished VIP speaker and then a stellar panel. So we'll start with our VIP speaker, and then I will ask our panelists to come on after that. Mr. Tae, if you could turn on your camera right now. I think everyone knows Tae Young-ho. He was recently elected to the South Korean National Assembly from the Gangnam district, becoming the first North Korean escapee to win a National Assembly seat through a constituency vote. He was previously a senior diplomat in the North Korean Foreign Ministry, including as the Deputy Chief of Mission in London before he escaped to South Korea. And what I find particularly interesting in his biography is that he escorted Kim Jong-un's older brother to a Eric Clapton concert in London. I'm a big fan of Eric Clapton, and I've never been to one of his concerts, so I'm quite envious of Mr. Tae's not only being able to rise to such senior positions in two countries, but also for that. So National Assembly Member Tae, we are truly honored to have you here today, and I'm very appreciative of your taking the time. So please turn your camera on now, and the floor is yours, and then I will afterwards ask our panel to turn on their cameras, but not until afterwards. Thank you, sir.
Hello and good morning, everyone in US. I'm told that Heritage is interested in short and clear position paper, so I just want to make a very short and clear presentation. In Seoul these days even, questions are focused on whether US and North Korea summit is likely, or will North Korea carry out a major provocation, such as a nuclear or ICBM test before American November election? My answer is, first, I do not think October surprise summit or any summit between US and North Korea is likely. My judgment is based on the statement by Kim Yo-jong on July 10th. To be honest, I have not seen any statement from North Korea like, this one, which is, almost 6 pages long and very ambiguous, but on the meanwhile, very well written. So that's why after the release of this statement by Kim Yo-jong, there are a lot of interpretations how we understand this one. So first of all, some of the quotations which I want to use is this one. Kim Yo-jong said in a statement, which I want to quote as follows on the summit issues. She said, first, the summit talks, if needed, they will only be needed for the US and they will be unprofitable to us. Second, we will only end up losing time again, even though we sit across with the US, which does not even have a courage to dare a new challenge, and it would only entail a risk of impairing the special relations that have been maintained between the top leaders. And third, it should not be accepted because it was foretold by Bolton, who is a human scum. Even though in her statement she mentioned the name of Bolton, but she emphasized the word of should not be accepted. A very strong word, should not be accepted. That means Kim Jong-un is unlikely to agree to such a summit short of any concrete results. Even though President Trump last week said that he would make deals with North Korea very quickly if re-elected in November. Still, President Trump did not state his clear terms of deal. So North Korea may regard the last week's Trump's statement as a kind of President Trump's campaign strategy to prevent Kim Jong-un from intervening in the election by military provocations. So then, without any summit the second half of this year before November election, the question is, then will North Korea make another strategic provocation? I don't think so. First, Kim Jong-un understands well that re-election of President Trump would be best chance of cutting a deal in favor of Kim Jong-un. I do not think Kim Jong-un will do anything provocative that might hurt Trump's chance of winning. Kim Jong-un still believes that if President Trump wins re-election, there is certainly a possibility for progress on denuclearization deal, and it is well worth the efforts to try. And second, despite the deadlock of nuclear negotiations between North Korea and the US, Kim Yo-jong, in her statement, has not fully ruled out the possibility of resuming talks with Washington in particular, ahead of US presidential election in November. While Kim Yo-jong downplayed the possibility of a brother meeting with President Trump again, in her statement, she unexpectedly requested a DVD of US Independence Day celebrations, which this kind of hint was really rare in North Korean system. Since that message on July 10 by Kim Yo-jong, so far, North Korea is not saying anything. So North Korea clearly stated, which I want to quote here, Kim Yo-jong's statement. Here Kim Yo-jong said, "We do not have slightest intention to pose a threat to the US, and Communist Chairman has already made that clear to President Trump. Everything will go smoothly if they leave us alone and make no provocation on us." That is the exact sentences which Kim Yo-jong used. So the probability of big military provocation by Kim Jong-un is unlikely. Thirdly, the current atmosphere in North Korea is not for provocation. In June, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un suspended envisaged military actions against South Korea amid growing tensions on the Korean peninsula, sparked by the North's demolition of an inter-Korean liaison office in the border city of Kaesong. In addition, even after that demolition, the South and the US scaled down their combined military exercises later this month, and by now in South Korea, I can't even hear any words of joint military exercise in August. And more importantly is the recently North Korea released grain from Kim Jong-un's own special stock for flood victims. I think everyone is very well aware that Kim Jong-un's grain reserves to a special stockpile of grain that can only be used in the event of war. So why all of a sudden North Korea, in the first time in history, opened the news that Kim Jong-un released the grain from his own special stock? I think this means that North Korea's current food situation is really, really difficult. And the second, because of these corona cases, North Korea is really in a difficult condition. So I think Kim Jong-un wants to send a kind of SOS signal to China, who is the only one who can send emergency aid to North Korea. So in the coming, months, in the second half of this year, if Kim Jong-un needs urgently the help from China, he cannot go on big military propagations against America. At last, I want to end my presentation by just saying a few words about the Christmas gifts which appeared twice by North Korea. Kim Yo-jong said in a statement, I quote, "The U.S. may still worry about receiving a Christmas gift on the eve of presidential elections, which it has not received so far." This is the second time North Korea used the word of Christmas gift. So I can imagine something big is already ready to show at any moment, whether it is new submarine or SLBM. It is clear that North Korea has made another progress in developing its strategic weapons. I have witnessed that after North Korea first emphasized the word of Christmas gift last December, the people like Lee Byung-chol, who is in charge of developing ICBM, and Park Byung-chun, Chief of Staff of North Korean Army, have made a very quick promotion in the rank of North Korea's Workers' Party of Korea. This kind of very quick promotion in the rank, which is almost impossible without any concrete progress in North Korea's strategic weaponry. So in a word, Kim Jong-un has not wasted the past 2.5 years dialogue period with the President Trump for further developing North Korean nuclear stockpiles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tae. That was a very comprehensive presentation, which covered a lot of ground. It sounds like from you that we're going to have a quiet few months before the election, whereas some of us, I think, may have expected we'd have some kind of excitement one way or the other. If I could invite my other panelists to turn on their cameras now, and we'll get started with the moderated discussion. So just a sort of short introduction of each of our panelists, who should be very well known to anyone who follows Korea. Jung Pak is the South Korea Foundation, or SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies and Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at Brookings. She's the recent author of Becoming Kim Jong-un, a former CIA officer's insights into North Korea's enigmatic young dictator, which I commend to everyone to read. She previously served at several positions in the CIA, including as Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the National Intelligence Council. And our next panelist is Marcus Galauskas. He led the U.S. intelligence community's strategic analysis on North Korea as the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea at the National Intelligence Council. And before that, he served 12 years in South Korea with the United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, U.S. Forces Korea, as the Chief of Intelligence Estimates, as well as the Chief of the Strategy Division. Do-yeon Kim is the Senior Advisor for Northeast Asia and Nuclear Policy at the International Crisis Group, previously at the Carnegie Endowment, and before that, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. And Do-yeon is sort of our ace in the hole, because she can be our forward observer in South Korea, since none of us can travel there due to the COVID virus. So that's a great advantage of hers. What I'm going to do is, rather than having presentations by the panelists, instead I will be moderating a discussion with the three of them. First, my questions will be, I'll have them, and then we'll throw them open to the questions from the audience. So first, I'm going to be focusing on interacting with the three panelists, and then I'll be bringing in Mr. Tae for his comments. So although we're going to cover a lot of topics, we are sort of focused initially, at least, on this October surprise. So to start us off, I want to look at a little bit more at the North Korean thinking and the objectives. So turning to Jung Pak, it seems like since Hanoi, there have been a number of themes in North Korean public statements. The increasing irrelevance of the relationship between Kim and Trump, even though they continue to describe it as good, a regime willingness to criticize and even insult President Trump, dismissing the potential for negotiations, although leaving the door open a crack for a summit or other meetings. And then also these threats of provocative action before the US election. So, if I could ask Jung to sort of flesh that out, what is North Korea thinking? What is their objective here?
Thanks, Bruce, and thank you to Assemblyman Tae for leading us off. And it's an honor to be with with this distinguished panel. Bruce, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what I think North Korea is doing right now. I think while the U.S. And experts in the U.S. tend to think of every action as driven by North Korea's desire to drive relations with the United States, I think at this point what we see is potentially more domestic focus. Kim has been focused on, since late January, of containing the coronavirus. The regime has been making great efforts to try to make sure that everyone in the world, domestically and internationally, they know that the North Koreans have this under control. Secondly, I think Kim has been using that as the coronavirus as an opportunity to start reining in what the regime has been talking about in terms of corruption and unbridled capitalism and marketization. I also think that given some of the heavy rains and some of the weather-related issues now, that there is a great focus on the regime trying to show that it is caring for its people. And I think that some of the things that we saw Kim Yo-jong say, I think that in part that there was a domestic motivation for that, to try to burnish her military credentials, to elevate her position in the regime for whatever purpose that Kim Jong-un has. That said, I agree with Assemblyman Tae on about the potential for an October surprise, a summit, or a strategic provocation before the election as being unlikely. That said, I think one of the things that Marcus, when he and I used to work together at the National Intelligence Council, one of the things that part of our job was to make sure that we don't have these very definitive statement about what North Korea is going to do. We're not engaging in predicting the right numbers for the lottery, for example, but we're trying to manage the risks for our senior policymakers. So let me close by pointing out some 4 things that I think that might be drivers for a summit or a strategic provocation. These are not mutually exclusive. And so let me lay them out very quickly and then send it back to you, Bruce. So here are 4 motivators or drivers for Kim Jong-un. I would say 1, that in order for a summit to happen, he would have to be reasonably sure that the U.S. had significant carrots to offer, and that these were sustainable and able to be implemented over the medium to long term. Secondly, Kim Jong-un, if he sees the election as that President Trump is unlikely to be elected, that he might see this as his last chance to make irreversible gains. Third, that because of his discomfort or over-dependence on China, that he might see an opportunity to try to keep Beijing's leaders on edge. As we know, as we've assessed in many other analyses, Chinese leaders have a fear of being marginalized in any conversations between United States and North Korea. And this might be a way that Kim might use it as leverage to either extract or to punish or to show his freedom of action vis-a-vis the Chinese leadership. Fourth, if Kim sees, I think that if we see a summit that Kim sees his economic situation as extremely dire, and that he requires assistance or he requires assistance from the United States or the international community, or he might conduct a strategic provocation to try to have the same, to reach the same goal. So let me stop there with those 4 drivers or potential motivators for Kim's decision making, whether he chooses a summit or strategic provocation. Thanks, Bruce.
Great, thanks very much. I had to smile when I heard drivers, since that was a phrase we so often used in the intelligence community. The other phrase I was waiting for was signposts along the particular path of what indicative of a direction a country was going on. Just to follow up on your second driver, my understanding from Mr. Tae was that he didn't think a summit was likely before the election, but that it would be in North Korea's best interest to have Trump reelected and be more likely to have an agreement under Mr. Trump. From your second point, it sounded like if North Korea didn't think President Trump was going to be reelected, then that would increase the potential for North Korea pushing for another summit before November. Is that correct?
Yeah, I also think that a summit before the election is highly unlikely, given what all sides are saying about this, and given that the U.S. has not changed its position on sanctions removal or any part that that North Korea cares about. But what if I've often wondered why North Korea hasn't pushed on various things to try to move the ball forward, that there's been an intense focus on sanctions reduction, but there are other things that North Korea could have pushed on that would be nibbling away at the edges of the US-South Korea alliance. For example, a peace treaty or a peace declaration. We know that President Trump has publicly announced that he wants some sort of peace declaration, that he's wanted this Nobel Peace Prize. And there is a constituency in the United States who might push for such a statement, as well as in South Korea. And I'll leave it to Jae-in Kim to talk about some of the South Korea motivations. So I think that I think that's something that could potentially be achievable. A peace declaration, which in many ways is symbolic, but it could set the stage for some other things that North Korea could take advantage of either later this year or in the next administration.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn to Marcus now. We haven't mentioned China, and I want to bring the 800-pound dragon into the room. Mr. Tae talked a bit about North Korea wanting to keep China's leaders on edge. Sort of looking the other direction, what do you think Beijing, their viewpoint on what's going on, the relative quiet in North Korea, given the threats throughout last year about either a Christmas gift or an end-of-year deadline, and that things would then become dire and unpredictable. So if you could sort of walk us through the Chinese objectives or Chinese thinking.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I think this is a great discussion. So, Bruce, I think first and foremost, China, and this seems almost cliche, seeks stability in the region, and is going to be looking to try and keep North Korea from doing anything in terms of an October surprise that might disrupt that stability. However, I think China recognizes also that it has very limited tools available to influence Kim's behavior. It has potentially a lot of leverage because we know North Korea is relying on aid a great deal right now because of the COVID restrictions. And we also know that the North Koreans, in the end, they really heavily rely on China for essentially for energy, for petroleum. However, I think there's another key variable to keep in mind here, and that's the fact that that because of the COVID restrictions, sanctions relief is not really something that can do a whole lot of good for North Korea right now. And even though China is pushing on sanctions relief, I think China also recognizes that even if they were to get some sort of sanctions relief for North Korea in that unlikely event, there's really not much value for North Korea right now, given the COVID restrictions. So I think China feels a little bit more constrained than usual in what it can really do to influence Kim's behavior, and I think it's resorting to some of its past tactics of trying to pressure the United States for restraint and emphasize the stability being an overriding shared goal between the United States and Beijing, and also trying, I think, to show it's in everyone's interest, even in North Korea's interest, to have stability. But in the end, I think the Chinese ability to affect the situation is going to be more limited than it usually is because of the COVID situation and because of the political environment in the United States.
And will China be more or less likely to try to either get involved or be more involved with the peninsula issues, given the very strained relations right now between Washington and Beijing?
Bruce, I think that's a spectacular point. I think what we saw from China in 2017 in terms of signing on to very, very strong sanctions and seeing strong sanctions enforcement, I think that moment was really enabled not just by this unprecedented level of weapons testing that came from North Korea and Kim's essentially very standoffish approach to Beijing in 2017, but also it was enabled by a relationship between Washington and Beijing that was in a much better place. And so I think China's willingness to sign on to major sanctions or even to threaten major sanctions, either return to stronger enforcement or new sanctions, I think that is going to be really much more limited, maybe even impossible in comparison to where it was in 2017. And I think that the North Korean regime probably understands that the sort of situation, the way the stars aligned in 2017, that really enabled that Chinese pressure on North Korea in response to the weapons testing, that's not the same environment that North Korea would be facing in the future. So I'm not saying that means North Korea is going to do a major test, but certainly counting on China to be the restraining factor right now seems to be a bad bet.
Right. So it would seem like there's perhaps conflicting objectives for Beijing. On the one hand, they want to keep things quiet and stable, no provocations, perhaps hoping for progress on denuclearization. But on the other hand, perhaps gaining some traction with Washington of, give us what we want on other issues, other lanes in the road. Otherwise, things could get more unstable on the peninsula. They've tried to play that North Korea card, but as you know, sometimes saying they have great influence over North Korea, so therefore the U.S. should offer concessions in other lanes in the road, and then at other times saying, oh, we can't control the North Koreans, don't look to us.
I think right now China is engaging in a blame game based on what we've seen from recent statements is essentially they're setting the conditions that if North Korea does do something particularly provocative or problematic, that they are going to pin it on the United States for not having offered North Korea more incentives, more sanctions relief. And certainly we saw that from the foreign minister just a few weeks ago, basically really putting the onus on the U.S. to provide some sort of incentives to North Korea, essentially a reward for what they seem to be thinking of as good behavior, the relative level of restraint North Korea's exercised in comparison to 2017.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Duyan now. Take advantage of your being there in Seoul, which we can't get to. There's been a lot of focus, though, amongst the Korea watchers in Washington about Moon Jae-in's new national security team and sort of how big a change that will represent in Moon's policy, as well as how much change can they actually bring about with North Korea, given that North Korea has been so dismissive of the Moon administration, and even quite insulting to President Moon himself. So, Duyan, what can we expect either differently or continuity from the Moon administration with this new team?
Well, first, thanks, Bruce, so much for having me, and in very good company with a distinguished panel. I think the bottom line here with the Moon government, they're trying to step on the gas on inter-Korean relations, to ramp that up, to try to get something going first, because they're not going to be able to have much contact with North Korea. But their biggest challenge right now is an unwilling North Korean partner. And we also know that President Moon has stated publicly too that he wants to help facilitate another Trump-Kim summit before the November election. Now, this is where your question comes into play. The new or the upgraded national security team, he's really brought all hands back on deck, basically, with some of his reshuffles. And, they're trying to, it seems like they're trying to probe every channel that they used to have, dating back years ago, dating back to Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il era. and trying to establish contact in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's why we're also hearing some of these proposals across the board, like cultural, humanitarian aid. And so I think that's the first order of business, to try to establish those contacts. And in a similar sense, or in that vein, they've brought back someone like the new intelligence chief, Park Ji-won, who used to have these intimate relationships with people under Kim's father, Kim Jong-il. But the big question here is that, does that translate into him having the same types of and level of access under a Kim Jong-un regime? And I think there are a lot of questions there, and a lot of skepticism there. So again, his big task will also be to try to cultivate these relationships. And so if you look at the Moon government's broad or general inter-Korean cooperation or inter-Korean relations approach, they're basically fundamentally using the same playbook and formula as previous progressive governments have used during Kim Dae-jung, Noe-hyun governments under Kim's father's regime. And that's where we're also seeing, things like the, humanitarian cooperation. They're trying to build up the scale of cooperation from smaller things and try to build it up to larger projects, of course, because of sanctions in place right now too. But this is where I have some skepticism, because it seems North Korea, unlike during his father, right now they actually want the big ticket items. They want things that will generate hard currency, foreign currency, big profits, cash. And predominantly largely due to the post-2016 sanctions in place, it's difficult or impossible for the Moon government to try to begin and resume those types of big ticket item cooperation projects. But so far the North has not responded. In other words, they're basically rejecting South Korea's proposals to resume inter-Korean cooperation. And so in that sense, the Kim Jong-un regime is different. In the past, and this is, Korea watchers know this for many years, that the typical South Korean progressive modus operandi has been to pay for a summit or pay for talks or pay for cooperation. But this is something that's also realistically difficult in today's context because of the sanctions in place. Even if they wanted to clandestinely try to, and perhaps Assemblyman Tae could answer this question in more detail, but I've been hearing that it's more difficult practically to try to clandestinely even send, whether it's in kind or money in kind, to try to jumpstart into Korean cooperation. And so, as we on this panel all know, that President Moon really needs to have progress on the nuclear front or denuclearization front, and progress between US and North Korea negotiations in order to start lifting sanctions, in order to resume inter-Korean cooperation projects. And right now, he's really struggling with having the sanctions in place, but also a North Korean partner that just is not willing to dance yet.
The new unification minister seems to be the most forward-leaning or most outspoken in pushing for ideas to improve relations between the Koreas. And I think that he's the one that perhaps some of us have the most concern about. He's talked about even the US-South Korea coordination group, which was set up after each capital had surprised the other with policy announcements. He's sort of saying that should either be done away with, or that has a separate lane in the road, and that inter-Korean relations are more the responsibility of the unification minister. And also South Koreans in the Moon administration have sort of repeatedly said, well, we don't think sanctions apply to this proposal, even though I think sanctions lawyers and others would say they clearly do. So do we need to be concerned that the Moon administration is going to be too eager, that it may be willing to risk strains in the relationship with Washington over trying to reach out on either economic or other initiatives? I'll direct that one to Dooyeon.
So even if in their heart of hearts they might want to do that, I think realistically it would be difficult for them to do it unless they're given a reason. And for example, that reason would be some sort of friction in the lines, whether it's Trump saying or doing something to upset South Korea, to give them some sort of reason to try to push the envelope more. But absent that type of excuse or justification or reason, you know, for now, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're eager to start, you know, violating sanctions and start being the ones to cause the tension and more friction in the alliance. So I think for now they're going to try to, you know, behind the scenes, try to convince the Trump administration as best they can to either show flexibility or to be more lenient. But here, this is where, you know, I would imagine many of our colleagues outside of government also would be trying to suggest to the Moon government, that sounds all great, but try to incentivize North Korea instead of unconditionally trying to give them a certain types of economic projects, you know, try to incentivize them to come out, at least to come out to real credible and meaningful dialogue or negotiations with the United States first before trying to jump on this whole, you know, inter-Korean cooperation projects that could run up against UN sanctions and other sanctions.
Okay, I want to turn now to sort of going down if there was a provocation path, and we can talk about drivers and signposts. So, Marcus, I'm going to start with you because I see your missile flight behind you there. The new strategic weapon. What might that be? And now I'll throw it open sort of for crossfire amongst the analysts. Sort of what would drive North Korea to feel that they had to do some kind of provocation, whether it's a display of something on, say, October 10th, the anniversary of the founding of the Korea Workers' Party, when they often have military parades, or launching or testing something. So Marcus, I'll start with you.
Bruce, I really appreciate the question. It's a great one. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I think we all need to keep in mind that there was a pretty definitive statement from Kim carried in North Korean state media on January 1st about the fact that the world would witness a new strategic weapon, and that also just a few sentences away in the same statement that he's no longer bound by his pledge to halt ICBM launches and nuclear testing. I think taken in combination, that's an ominous sign for where North Korea plans to go with strategic weapons testing. And just because we haven't seen that new strategic weapon really demonstrated yet, doesn't mean that it's not going to happen later this year or early next year. I look back to the example of 2017. Kim's New Year's address talked about the final stages of preparations for an ICBM launch, but we didn't see that ICBM first launch until the 4th of July. So I think we need to keep in mind these things play out over time. So as far as what it is, I see a lot of speculation that it's a ballistic missile submarine. That seems to be sort of the latest, you know, kind of rumor or speculation. And I was able to find a reference in North Korean state media in English to a ballistic missile sub in the past being called a strategic weapon. So I think we can't rule that idea out. But that term has much more often been used to refer to long-range nuclear capable missiles. And I think it's also important to keep in mind North Korea has already tested new SLBM late last year, and that North Korea state media gave us glimpses last summer of a submarine that's not really that new or all that impressive. So if the new strategic weapon is really just a ballistic missile sub, this really doesn't change the equation much, and frankly, it's not really that big strategically of an event. However, there's some far more significant possibilities of what this new strategic weapon could be that would really pose a far more serious threat. So back in January, not long after the statement about the new strategic weapon, we saw a comment from a South Korean lawmaker that was picked up in the South Korean press that this new strategic weapon could be a missile with more than one warhead, essentially what's called a MIRV, multiple independent reentry vehicles. And this would be a far more significant development than a new sub, because it would mean two things. First of all, that North Korea could potentially strike multiple targets with the launch of just one missile. And second, it also means that missile defense becomes much more complicated against this type of a weapon. And so you'll of course recall during the Cold War when MIRVs were developed, this was a huge setback for proponents of missile defense, because it makes missile defense not only much more difficult, but much less efficient, because you have to build multiple interceptors for each missile that's incoming, because you have to intercept multiple warheads, multiple reentry vehicles. And so I personally wouldn't be surprised if we saw a test launch of one of these missiles with multiple warheads as an October surprise, or even before October. But I think Kim's hedging his bets in his relationship with the president before the election, as Assemblyman Tae mentioned, with the message that came from Kim Yo-jong on the 10th of July. So I think it's more likely, actually, to allude to one of your possibilities that you raised, Bruce, is the idea that it would be displayed at the traditional parade for the Korean Workers' Party anniversary on the 10th of October. And because this is a 75th anniversary year, and in 2015, 5 years ago, we also saw pretty significant displays of strategic weapons. I would expect the same this year. And so some sort of advanced types of strategic weapons, even if there isn't something really large scale launched in October. And frankly, given their track record and given Kim's statement, I would actually be more surprised if they didn't display a new strategic weapon this October. I think the bigger question is, are they going to do a launch beyond some of these shorter range systems or ICBM? I think that's the larger question, and that may wait until after the results of the election are clear.
Okay. I'll first ask if anyone else wants to jump in on sort of the provocation angle, and then I do have a lot of good questions from the audience. So, a driver or initiative on provocation, Dooyeon?
Hi. So, sorry, Marcus, I lost you for several minutes there, so I might be repeating things that you've already said, and the screen froze. But I think I heard the beginning part of some of the stuff that you said, and I would agree with your points of, and even Assemblyman Tae mentioned a couple too, and Bruce. But it really could be in the form of just putting it on display, a new strategic weapon on display during their military parade. It could be showing this new submarine. It could actually be launching a submarine launched ballistic missile. It could be further, short, medium range ballistic missiles, multiple rocket launchers. So it really could be the whole spectrum of different types of weaponry. I suspect so far, based on what we're hearing and seeing from North Korean statements and the mood with the United States, I do not think it is likely that they would go as far as testing ICBMs before the election. I think Jung mentioned this in her remarks. But I think there's a critical moment that we need to look at, which is the day after the U.S. election, in between November 4th until January 20th, and when a new president comes in or Trump is reelected. And I think during that period, so for example, if candidate Biden is elected as president, then North Korea could see this as an opportunity to ramp up their testing of their weaponry with all different types and classes of missiles. Might take advantage of not only to fulfill their military imperatives to perfect their technology, but also to send a message to newly elected President Biden saying, you can't mess with us, and to try to increase their leverage before future negotiations, whenever that may be, whenever they decide to return to negotiations. If President Trump is reelected, I suspect the likelihood of them of waging a huge provocation is probably low. They might want to wait and see how President Trump reacts to North Korea in a new presidential term, and then decide whether it wants to escalate or not.
Okay, I'm going to turn to the audience questions now. Our first one is for Assemblyman Tae. Well, a pretty encompassing one here, sir. What do you think is the most effective way to solve the North Korean problem? So obviously a very expansive question, one that all of us have been struggling with decades. So sort of take any part of that broad topic you'd like, sir.
The first thing North Korea always wants to do is to reach a kind of deal or compromise from South Korea and the United States. The major goal for North Korea is to achieve the status of a nuclear state. So they want to achieve the same goal like what China, India, or Pakistan have done as a kind of a nuclear state. When I was in North Korea, the continuation of those, the policies and the propaganda work always was something like, why North Korea cannot achieve the same state like what China or Pakistan or India did in the past. So why not for North Korea? So still Kim Jong-un and it's the regime strongly believe in that they can also achieve the same thing which China and India and Pakistan achieved. So I think for America and South Korea, we should continue to tell to Kim Jong-un regime that North Korea is different from China, India, or Pakistan, because North Korea stated openly and continuously that the purpose of their nuclear weapons are targeted America. They directly pose a threat to American interests. That is really great big difference from China or India or Pakistan, their nuclear weapons. So that's why we should tell North Korea very clearly, at any cost, America or South Korea not to accept the North Korea's status as nuclear, the weapon state. I think that is the thing we should do. The second thing is that I think we need a kind of harmonization between South Korea and America on North Korea's nuclear issues. For instance, now America, even after Trump administration, American administration now keeps on its principle on denuclearization issues, something like without solving the nuclear issues with North Korea, America cannot ease sanctions against North Korea. While in South Korea things are different because current South Korean government continues to give a kind of signal to North Korea that they can want to skip the current sanction regime by developing inter-Korean relations first and then nuclear issues second. So I think this is really give a wrong impression or signal to North Korea. I think America and South Korea stay in one. We should not make kind of different signal or approach towards Kim Jong-un regime. I think that is secondly important thing.
Great, thank you very much, sir. We have a question from our friend and colleague Mark Tokala over at Korea Economic Institute.
Can you hear?
Yes, we could hear you, sir.
Yes. From your,
yes, sir. We could hear you. Thank you. So a question, I'll send this one to Marcus, since Mark asks, if, as Assemblyman Tay says, this is a time when China has leverage over North Korea because of the food shortages, what will China ask of North Korea in exchange for assistance?
So going back to my earlier comments, I think the Chinese generally want to keep things at a state, right? They're trying to minimize the potential for a major confrontation. I don't think they're going to ask much from North Korea other than, we're dealing with this COVID situation, we're dealing with all these challenges with the U.S. Just you can continue to do some low-level weapons testing. You can continue to be rhetorically, provocative, but let's keep it below a certain threshold, I think would be sort of the informal understanding. However, I must respectfully disagree that the aid actually gives China that much leverage. China is providing aid to North Korea to avoid a humanitarian crisis on its border. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart, and they're not really doing it, I think, in the expectation of getting much leverage out of it with North Korea. Because I think in the end it's a phony threat. If China pulls its humanitarian assistance to North Korea, China's going to be hurt just as much as North Korea in the end, and North Korea could just open the floodgates and make China pay a price for that, or be very provocative in response. So I think that's a very self-defeating tactic, and I think the Chinese really have not shown willingness to use humanitarian aid as a weapon. Sanctions, perhaps, but I don't think they would pull humanitarian aid or cut off fuel to North Korea. It's a great threat, but I don't think it's practical right now for the Chinese to use.
Okay, another question from a colleague, Guy Aragoni. President Trump has alluded to quickly reaching an agreement with North Korea after the election. How will his stated timeline influence North Korea's decisions? And that could either be to delay on a provocation or delay on a summit. Perhaps I'll start with you, Jung.
Guy, I wish I could see your handsome face as you asked that question. Great, really great to hear from you. So I think on the timeline and what President Trump has been saying, I think it's, quickly reaching a deal. I think that a potential second Trump administration, I think would be, would likely be less tethered to some of the tenets that we've been following in terms of North Korea policy. That a lot of this, the president clearly wants to have some kind of deal with North Korea. On the one hand, it could be at this point when he says it, it could be a way to continue to dangle to North Korea that this relationship will be good. Don't try anything provocative in the meantime, and then I can give you, promise some other goodies later. But I think that in terms of timeline, I think what the other panelists have said, and I'll foot stomp this, in that I think we're going to see a period of uneasy stability in the coming months into the end of the year, where we're going to be constantly having this conversation about will he or won't he, whether the President Trump or Kim Jong-un, in terms of what they're willing to engage with each other on. So I think that in the meantime, I think Kim might see it to be in his interest to not stir the waters too much at this point, and that we might see a president that he might be calculating that a second Trump administration could make more headway on this. But I'm also not going to be. I'm not sure what Kim assesses President Trump can do even in the second term. Given that Congress, there's bipartisan support for human rights in North Korea, bipartisan support on sanctions and maintaining the pressure on North Korea. But that said, there are other ways that the president can massage the relationship. And I mentioned having a peace declaration or a symbolic, some sort of peace related statement in the Trump administration.
Okay, Marcus, you had a two-finger.
So as is typical, I agree with Jung, of course, but I want to add one other point that I think is really critical to this whole conversation. I don't think we should underestimate how much Hanoi was a tremendous defeat for Kim Jong-un, and how the aftermath of that is still with Kim and with his regime. Kim Yong-chol, his longtime mentor, gets fired as a result of Hanoi. Kim Yo-jong has to keep a little bit of a low profile. Many other people, and maybe Senator Tay, you may know this better than I do in terms of who was purged and who was punished specifically in the aftermath of Hanoi. But it's pretty clear that there were a lot of people in the North Korean regime system who were involved in the Hanoi summit planning and preparations that were punished in some way, in some level of severity. So the fact that this was a huge defeat for Kim personally, an embarrassment for him, a defeat for the regime system, for the advisors, means that the threshold is going to be very high for the North Koreans to be willing to support another summit, and his advisor to say to Kim, hey, you're going to be able to get a good deal out of this situation. So I think it militates in favor of everything that Johnny is saying, but I would take it even a step further to say that the standard is going to be extremely high, I think, for getting North Korea to the table for another summit.
Okay, I saw Duyan.
Yeah, just to add another layer of detail, I agree with what Jung and Marcus have both said, but just to add to tie those two comments together, if Kim Jong-un will be, of course, looking for something in return where he is not going home empty-handed, right? Just like what Marcus said. Now, the level of detail I want to add is, so far, since Hanoi until now, the barter that North Korea is willing to engage in is the whole Yongbyon 4 UN sanctions relief. And that's the trade-off, and that's the main sticking point right now. The other stuff, it's all window dressing and stuff that they already know they're going to get. Things like liaison office, things like, some sort of symbolic peace declaration or whatnot. And so if, and this is something where it's different from his father's time in negotiations, where during his father, they had a long wish list, a long laundry list of asks. I mean, we didn't know what they wanted until the last minute, and when they pocketed some concessions. But now under Kim Jong-un, they negotiate in a very tight box, and if they don't get it, if they don't get what they're demanding, that barter that they're demanding, they walk away from the table. And when we see this during inter-Korean negotiations between the Moon government and Kim Jong-un before this whole symmetry with Trump and Kim. And so if Kim Jong-un continues to insist on that's the only bargain on the table, then the next, if Trump is reelected, it'll still be difficult and challenging on a substantive level in negotiations. And if Kim Jong-un is not able to empower his negotiators to think creatively and to try to present other types of scenarios, other compromise scenarios, then we're going to be stuck in this same situation we're in today.
Great. I have a question for Assemblyman Tae from Alexander Vershbow, Sandy Vershbow, our former ambassador to South Korea. He asks you, how much does North Korea worry about South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons?
Oh, I don't think North Korea would believe in any possibility of South Korea's possession of nuclear weapons, because North Korea clearly understands that the opening of possibility of South Korea arming with nuclear weapons would give another chance, to Japan, which would create really, the threat for the non-proliferation regime. So that's why I don't think any the debate on the possibility of South Korea's arming with nuclear weapons could give any kind of very serious thinking to the North Korean regime, because basically North Korea does not believe in any possibility of South Korea's nuclear weaponry.
Great, thank you. Well, I think the sign of a good meeting is, unfortunately, we've run out of time long before we've run out of questions. Hopefully we can do this again, because unfortunately we do have a lot of really good questions. I think in summary, it sounds like there's a sense amongst the panel that a provocation or a summit is not as likely as or is unlikely more than many people think. But it does seem like there's good arguments can be made for both why North Korea would and would not do a provocation, as well as would and would not do a summit. And so it all comes down to, we're not very sure. It's what we used to call at CIA giving someone the CIA salute, which is, we don't really know what will happen. We'll just have to keep watching. So I do want to thank all of our panelists for, and especially National Assembly Member Tae for giving his time, for sharing their insights. I thank the audience for staying with us on such an important conversation. If you work on the Hill or a think tank or just have questions, please feel free to contact me using the information listed on the screen. I'd love to continue the conversation. And immediately following this event, you'll receive a survey that we hope you'll complete so you can bring items that you care about to the public square. So you can see the events that Heritage is having on other issues, and check out that on heritage.org/events. So again, thank you to all my panelists. Thank you to National Assembly Member Tay, and thank you to the audience. So we are adjourned. Thank you again.